Hockey is a game of speed, passion, and pride, and no one brought that to life more than Guy Lafleur. Nicknamed the Flower, he was the heartbeat of the Montreal Canadiens, dazzling fans with his skating, his scoring, and his flair for the dramatic. He wasn't just great, he was unforgettable. But even legends like Guy Lafleur carried grudges. Behind the highlight reels and the Stanley Cups were rivalries filled with hard hits, bitter words, and battles that left scars. While Guy Lafleur respected greatness, there were players, and even a coach, he simply couldn't stand. Today, we're diving into the 6 players Guy Lafleur hated the most, plus one coach who pushed his patience to the limit, and the stories that made those rivalries so unforgettable. Before we jump into the list, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps us keep bringing you more stories about the rivalries and legends that shaped hockey history. Bobby Clarke, Philadelphia Flyers. Bobby Clarke was the face of the Philadelphia Flyers, and to many, the ultimate symbol of the Broad Street Bullies. As the fiery captain of a team built on intimidation, Clarke led with grit, toughness, and an edge that often pushed the line. He wasn't the biggest player on the ice, but his heart and aggression made him one of the most feared. For Guy Lafleur, who represented pure skill, speed, and finesse, Clarke was the opposite. The living reminder that hockey wasn't always about artistry, it was about survival. The Flyers of the 1970s built their reputation by bruising opponents into submission. They wanted to drag skilled players into the mud, to make them uncomfortable and shake their confidence. Clarke embraced that role fully. He was relentless in chasing down stars like Guy Lafleur, slashing, chirping, and never giving an inch. To Guy Lafleur, who relied on open ice and freedom to skate, Clarke's style felt like an assault on everything he stood for. Every time Montreal faced Philadelphia, it wasn't just a game, it was a test of whether brilliance could withstand brutality. Stories from that era paint the rivalry as personal and vicious. Clarke's Flyers didn't just play hard, they played mean. Cheap shots, cross-checks, late hits, nothing was off limits. Guy Lafleur, who had fought hard to become the Canadiens' shining star, hated how Clarke and his crew targeted finesse players like him. There's an infamous tale of Clarke wielding his stick like a weapon, hacking at opponents in ways that made even tough veterans shake their heads. For Guy Lafleur, it wasn't only painful, it was insulting. Clarke represented the idea that brute force could overshadow skill, and that was something Guy Lafleur could never accept. Yet, in a strange way, the rivalry pushed Guy Lafleur to greater heights. To face Clarke and still dominate proved just how unstoppable he truly was. When Guy Lafleur flew down the wing and scored despite the bruises, it was a message. No amount of bullying could cage his brilliance. Fans remember those Canadiens-Flyers showdowns as wars, battles where Guy Lafleur's fire had to shine through waves of punishment. Clarke may have been the villain, but he gave Guy Lafleur some of the greatest tests of his career. Their clashes weren't just about goals and wins. They were about proving that elegance and artistry could stand tall against the ugliest tactics the game had to offer. And if Bobby Clarke was the man who tried to beat Guy Lafleur with grit and intimidation, the next rival attacked him in a different way, by stealing his crown as the NHL's most dangerous scorer. That man was Mike Bossy of the New York Islanders, and their rivalry told a very different kind of story. Mike Bossy, New York Islanders. If Bobby Clarke was the rival who tried to break Guy Lafleur's spirit with intimidation, Mike Bossy was the rival who threatened Guy Lafleur's legacy with pure brilliance. Playing for the New York Islanders, Bossy arrived in the late 1970s as a new kind of sniper, a cold-blooded goal scorer who made lighting the lamp look effortless. For years, Guy Lafleur had been the NHL's most feared offensive force, the player every defenseman and goalie dreaded. But when Bossy came along, the balance of power shifted. To Guy Lafleur, this wasn't just another opponent, this was a man stealing his throne. The Canadiens were coming off one of the most dominant dynasties in sports history. 4 straight Stanley Cups, led by Guy Lafleur at the peak of his powers. Then, almost overnight, the Islanders rose to power. Bossy's release was lightning quick, his accuracy deadly. He didn't need to bully anyone at Potvin, and he didn't need to dance around with the puck like Guy Lafleur. He just scored and scored and scored. For Guy Lafleur, who thrived on being the league's ultimate showman, it was infuriating to watch another winger suddenly become the headline act. There's a famous story about how Canadiens veterans used to test rookies in practice to see if they could withstand the pressure, but Bossy wasn't intimidated by anyone. The moment he stepped onto NHL ice, he looked like he belonged. Guy Lafleur, who had earned his way up through years of pressure in Montreal, couldn't help but resent the ease with which Bossy seemed to climb into his spot at the top. And when Bossy and the Islanders finally toppled the Canadiens, ending Montreal's reign, Guy Lafleur felt the sting even deeper. The Guy Lafleur-Bossy contrast was almost poetic. Guy Lafleur was the artist, hair flowing as he skated with elegance, scoring with style. Bossy was the machine, efficient, precise, deadly. Every time the Canadiens faced the Islanders, it was a battle not just for goals, but for supremacy in the league's narrative. Fans and media started asking, was Guy Lafleur still the game's most dangerous forward, or had Bossy taken that crown? For a proud legend like Guy Lafleur, those questions were like salt in the wound. And yet, looking back, that rivalry defined an era. The NHL wasn't just about one superstar anymore, it was about the passing of torches, about dynasties rising and falling. Bossy didn't just beat Guy Lafleur's Canadiens, he forced Guy Lafleur to confront the reality that even legends can be replaced. For Guy Lafleur, that made the rivalry sting more than any slasher hit ever could. But if Bossy represented the rival who challenged Guy Lafleur's scoring crown, the next name on our list took things to an even darker place. He wasn't just an offensive weapon, he was a bruising captain who stood in Guy Lafleur's path with mean streaks and bone-crunching hits. That man was Denis Potvin, and for Guy Lafleur, he was the face of New York's muscle. Denis Potvin, New York Islanders. If Mike Bossy was the rival who challenged Guy Lafleur's scoring crown, then Denis Potvin was the one who stood in his way with brute force. Potvin wasn't just a defenseman, he was the captain of the New York Islanders. A leader who combined skill with a mean streak that made every shift a war. Strong, physical, and unafraid to bend the rules, Potvin embodied everything that drove Guy Lafleur crazy. He didn't just try to stop Guy Lafleur, he tried to punish him for daring to skate with flair. Every Canadiens-Islanders game in the late 70s and early 80s felt like a heavyweight bout. Guy Lafleur, the league's most dazzling scorer, would charge down the wing with the crowd roaring. Waiting for him was Potvin, who had no problem laying the body hard, chopping with his stick, or throwing a hit that made the boards rattle. For Guy Lafleur, it wasn't just about being checked, it was about being hunted. Potvin relished being the man to slow down the flower, and Guy Lafleur despised how relentless and physical he was. One of the most famous anecdotes comes from their playoff battles. In the early 1980s, the Canadiens were trying to hold on to their dynasty, but Potvin's Islanders were rising fast. Potvin delivered hit after hit on Guy Lafleur, cutting off his space and wearing him down. Teammates remembered Guy Lafleur's frustration boiling over, the sight of him skating back to the bench, shaking his head, knowing that Potvin wasn't going to give him a single moment of peace. To fans, it was thrilling. To Guy Lafleur, it was suffocating. The rivalry between the two was more than personal, it was symbolic. Guy Lafleur represented the artistry of the Canadiens dynasty, the beauty of speed and skill. Potvin represented the new era of power and control, where defense could dictate terms, and toughness could shut down even the most gifted scorers. Their clashes were a battle between two philosophies, and more often than not, Potvin got the last word. The Islanders dynasty, led by Potvin, officially pushed Montreal aside, and that was a wound Guy Lafleur never forgot. Looking back, Potvin was everything Guy Lafleur hated in an opponent. Skilled enough to compete with him, strong enough to hurt him, and ruthless enough to enjoy it. To this day, fans of that era still talk about their duels as some of the nastiest battles between two superstars. For Guy Lafleur, facing Potvin wasn't just about trying to score, it was about surviving. But while Potvin embodied the power of New York's dynasty, Guy Lafleur also had to deal with bitter rivalries closer to home. Few battles burned hotter than the clashes between Montreal and Toronto, and at the heart of those wars was Leafs captain Darryl Sittler, a man who pushed Guy Lafleur to his limits in Canada's fiercest rivalry. Darryl Sittler, Toronto Maple Leafs. If Denis Potvin was the rival who symbolized New York's rise, then Darryl Sittler was the man who carried Toronto's pride on his shoulders. As captain of the Toronto Maple Leafs, Sittler was the heart and soul of his team, tough, determined, and unwilling to back down from anyone. He was everything Toronto fans wanted in a leader, and for Guy Lafleur, that made him both respected and despised. Whenever the Canadiens and Leafs met, it wasn't just two teams colliding, it was the weight of Canada's fiercest rivalry. And at the center of it all were Sittler and Guy Lafleur, two stars who refused to give an inch. The Habs-Leafs rivalry of the 1970s was unlike anything else. Every game carried the tension of history, geography, and national pride. For Montreal, Guy Lafleur was the shining superstar, dazzling fans with his speed and scoring touch. For Toronto, Sittler was the warrior who stood toe-to-toe with the dynasty. Guy Lafleur respected Sittler's talent, but respect didn't soften the blows. Each time they faced off, the games felt like wars, and both men knew the stakes. One of the most talked about moments came during a playoff clash in 1978. The Canadiens, loaded with Hall of Fame talent, were expected to steamroll the Leafs, but Sittler, leading by example, played like a man possessed. He battled in the corners, threw his weight around, and challenge Montreal's stars shift after shift. Guy Lafleur, who was used to overwhelming teams with skill, found himself in a grind where nothing came easy. Montreal would ultimately win, but Sittler's fire made sure the Canadiens earned every inch. Stories from those games say Guy Lafleur admired Sittler's fight, but hated how hard the Leafs pushed them, turning what could have been a routine series into a brutal showdown. The contrast between the two captains was striking. Guy Lafleur was elegance, hair flying, skating effortlessly, making the game look beautiful. Sittler was grit, grinding, clawing, and willing to bleed for every goal. When they collided, it wasn't just about hockey. It was about proving whose style could define Canada's game. Fans on both sides still argue about those matchups, but one thing is clear. They brought out the best and sometimes the worst in both men. For Guy Lafleur, Sittler was the rival who could never be dismissed. He may not have hated him with the same venom he had for Clarke or Potvin, but every time he saw that blue and white jersey across from him, he knew it was going to be a battle. Those nights against Toronto weren't just games, they were wars for pride, and Sittler was always at the heart of them. And if Sittler represented the enemy captain from Canada's biggest rivalry, Guy Lafleur also had to face rivals even closer to home. In practice, he often said he hated going up against one man in particular, a goalie who made scoring feel impossible. That man was Ken Dryden, and their battles behind closed doors were as fierce as anything Guy Lafleur faced under the lights. Ken Dryden, practice rival, Canadiens goalie. Not every rivalry Guy Lafleur carried was against a man in a different sweater. Some of his toughest battles came within the walls of the Montreal Forum, away from the cameras, in the daily grind of practice. And at the center of those battles stood Ken Dryden, the towering Canadiens goalie who frustrated Guy Lafleur more than anyone else. Dryden wasn't an enemy, but to Guy Lafleur, he was the one man who made scoring feel like climbing a mountain. In Guy Lafleur's own words, he often hated going up against Dryden in practice because it felt like nothing ever got past him. Dryden was unique. Standing 6'4", a giant by the standards of his time, he covered the net in a way most goalies simply couldn't. He wasn't flashy, but he was calm, calculating, and nearly unshakable. For Guy Lafleur, who thrived on beating goalies clean with speed and precision, Dryden was a nightmare. Every time Guy Lafleur unleashed his booming slap shot or snapped a quick wrist shot, Dryden was there, glove flashing, pads sealing the ice, making it look almost effortless. Teammates used to laugh about it. They'd say Guy Lafleur would skate back after another denied attempt, muttering under his breath, shaking his head in frustration. He was a superstar, but Dryden had a way of making him feel human, and that's what made those practice duels so intense. Guy Lafleur hated it in the moment, but deep down, he knew it was sharpening his blade. If he could find a way to beat Dryden, even just once in practice, it gave him the confidence that no goalie in the league could truly stop him. There's an old saying in hockey, iron sharpens iron. That was the story of Guy Lafleur and Dryden. Their practice sessions weren't casual warm-ups, they were silent wars, each man pushing the other to new heights. Dryden admitted later that facing Guy Lafleur every day was its own test, because if he could track Guy Lafleur's speed and shot, he knew he could handle anyone in the NHL. For Guy Lafleur, the frustration of being stopped again and again fueled him to attack games with even more ferocity. Looking back, this rivalry wasn't about hatred in the traditional sense, and it was about respect, competition, and the constant demand to be better. Guy Lafleur may have hated facing Dryden at practice, but he also knew those battles helped forge his greatness. It was a rivalry that lived behind closed doors, but its impact showed every time Guy Lafleur hit the ice and terrorized opposing goalies. And if Dryden tested Guy Lafleur's patience in practice, from the crease, there was another teammate who made life miserable in a different way. Towering, physical, and just as relentless, Larry Robinson never gave Guy Lafleur an inch in training, and those clashes became legendary. Larry Robinson. If Ken Dryden was the wall that tested Guy Lafleur's shot in practice, then Larry Robinson was the mountain that tested his courage. Standing 6'4" and playing with a mix of elegance and brute strength, Robinson was the cornerstone of Montreal's blue line during the dynasty years. To fans, he was Big Bird, a Hall of Fame defenseman who could shut down anyone. To Guy Lafleur, he was the nightmare in practice who never gave him a free inch of ice. Robinson may have been a teammate, but in those training battles, he became one of Guy Lafleur's fiercest rivals. Robinson had a reputation for being a smart, disciplined defenseman, but he wasn't soft. He played physical, leaned on opponents, and used his size to suffocate space. In practice, he treated Guy Lafleur no differently than he would a Flyers winger or an Islanders sniper. There were no shortcuts, no easy lanes. Guy Lafleur admitted years later that Robinson never took it easy, not once. For Guy Lafleur, who thrived on open ice, it was infuriating to go up against a man who seemed to anticipate his every move. The stories of their practice duels became legend in Montreal. Teammates recalled the intensity. Guy Lafleur, flying down the wing, hair flowing, ready to uncork his trademark shot, and Robinson, cool and calculating, would angle him off, crush him against the boards, or lift his stick at the perfect moment. Some players might have eased up on their superstar teammate, but Robinson never did. He believed that pushing Guy Lafleur in practice was the only way to prepare him for the chaos of real games. Guy Lafleur, on the other hand, hated it in the moment. To him, it felt like every drill was a war, but those battles carried a deeper meaning. Guy Lafleur's frustration against Robinson turned into fuel. If he could figure out a way to beat one of the league's best defensemen day after day in practice, then he could beat anyone under the bright lights. And for Robinson, shutting down Guy Lafleur wasn't about making a point, it was about sharpening both of their edges. The Canadiens' dynasty wasn't built on talent alone, it was built on teammates who demanded the best from each other, even if it meant clashing behind closed doors. Guy Lafleur often said later in life that Robinson made him better, even though he hated facing him in those moments. Their practice rivalry symbolized what made Montreal's dynasty so powerful. Iron sharpening iron, greatness breeding more greatness. Guy Lafleur may have worn the spotlight, but Robinson's shadow was always there, testing him, toughening him, preparing him for the wars that awaited. And while Robinson pushed Guy Lafleur's limits in practice, there was one figure who drew out a different kind of hatred altogether. He wasn't a teammate battling in drills or a defenseman from another team, he was a coach. A man whose defensive philosophy clashed with everything Guy Lafleur believed about hockey. That man was Jacques Lemaire, and their conflict was unlike any other. Jacques Lemaire, former teammate, later coach. Not all of Guy Lafleur's rivalries were with opponents wearing different jerseys. Some of the deepest bitterness came from a man he once called a teammate, Jacques Lemaire. During their playing days, Lemaire was a respected center for the Canadiens, known for his intelligence and reliability. But when he stepped behind the bench as a coach, he became the symbol of everything Guy Lafleur despised about hockey. Where Guy Lafleur represented freedom, creativity, and offense, Lemaire embodied discipline, structure, and defense. Their philosophies clashed violently, and Guy Lafleur made it no secret that he hated Lemaire's infamous trap system, a style he once called the death of offensive hockey. The conflict wasn't about dirty hits or personal grudges, it was about the soul of the game. Lemaire believed in controlling the pace, shutting down opponents, and winning through suffocating defense. Guy Lafleur believed in opening the game up, flying down the wing, and dazzling fans with artistry. When Lemaire's trap began to dominate the NHL, Guy Lafleur felt betrayed. This wasn't the hockey he had bled for. This wasn't the game that made him a legend. To him, it was like watching the beauty of hockey be locked in a cage. There's a story Guy Lafleur shared later in life where he flat out refused to bite his tongue. He said the trap was boring hockey and openly blamed Lemaire for strangling the excitement out of the game. Fans who loved end-to-end action sided with Guy Lafleur, while others defended Lemaire's results. But for Guy Lafleur, it was never about the wins. It was about the spirit of hockey. And to him, Lemaire's system killed that spirit. This rivalry wasn't fought in corners or along the boards, but in the court of ideas. It showed the stark divide between two eras. One where offense and creativity defined the NHL, and another where structure and defense took over. For Guy Lafleur, who had built his legacy on flair, it was a rivalry that cut deep because it felt personal, like the game itself was being reshaped against everything he stood for. And that's what made Jacques Lemaire the most surprising name on Guy Lafleur's hate list. He wasn't just another player or rival, he was proof that even old teammates could become enemies when their visions of hockey collided. These weren't just rivalries, they were battles that defined Guy Lafleur's era. From bruising enforcers to practice wars with his own teammates, each clash tested his pride, his toughness, and his place among hockey's legends. Guy Lafleur's greatness wasn't only in the goals he scored, but in the grudges and challenges that shaped his story. But what do you think? Did I miss a player or coach Guy Lafleur truly couldn't stand? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear who you would add to the list. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into hockey history, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. It really helps us bring more legendary rivalries and stories from the game straight to you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.